Chapter 1. The Surgeon Who Became a Monster. Pingfang, Manchuria. August 1945. Dr. Shirō Ishii stood in his laboratory watching everything burn. Documents fed into incinerators. Equipment smashed and buried. Buildings rigged with explosives. The evidence of 7 years of work disappearing in smoke and rubble. But the knowledge remained. In his head, in the heads of his colleagues, in the detailed reports carefully hidden for future bargaining, knowledge purchased with at least 3,000 human lives, possibly 10,000 or more. Men, women, and children subjected to experiments that redefined human cruelty. Vivisection without anesthesia. Intentional infection with plague, anthrax, and cholera. Frostbite studies that involved freezing limbs and testing treatments. Pressure chamber experiments that ruptured organs. Weapon tests using live human targets, all meticulously documented, all justified as scientific research. All about to become the most valuable bargaining chip in post-war Asia. You'd not find much information on this death lab? Much channels do not talk about it. Journals do not discuss this topic. Why is it kept so hidden? What is all the secrecy about? We will expose and discuss the death lab today. That nobody else dared to be, for we descend into this darkness. I need you to understand something. This video contains descriptions of real atrocities committed against real human beings. It's historically important, but deeply disturbing. If you appreciate detailed, fact-based historical investigation into difficult subjects, hit that like button now. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're exploring the hidden scandals of World War II that textbooks avoid. Comment below, should the United States have granted immunity to war criminals in exchange for scientific data? This is history we cannot forget. Shirō Ishii was born in 1892 in Chiba Prefecture, Japan, into a wealthy family. He was brilliant. Genuinely, measurably brilliant. He graduated from Kyoto Imperial University's medical school in 1920, one of Japan's most prestigious institutions. His early career was promising and conventional. He worked as an army surgeon. He published research papers. He was respected in 1924. The Imperial Japanese Army sent him on a 2-year research tour of the West. He visited universities and military facilities across Europe and North America, studying bacteriology and public health. But what captured his attention was biological warfare. The 1925 Geneva Protocol had banned the use of biological weapons in warfare. To Ishii, this suggested that such weapons must be effective. Otherwise, why ban them? He returned to Japan in 1928, convinced that biological warfare represented the future of military power. A nation like Japan, resource-poor but scientifically advanced, could develop weapons that would neutralize the advantages of larger, wealthier enemies. Ishii was charismatic and politically savvy. He cultivated relationships with nationalist military officers who were gaining power in Japan's increasingly militarized government. He argued that biological weapons research was essential for national defense. Other nations were certainly developing such weapons. Japan needed to keep pace. He also argued that effective biological weapons required human testing. Animal studies could only reveal so much. Real military effectiveness required data from human subjects. This was his pitch. And incredibly, it worked. In 1932, with the support of Army leadership, Ishii established the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department in Manchuria, the Japanese-occupied territory in northeast China. The official purpose was defensive, protecting Japanese troops from disease and ensuring safe water supplies. The real purpose was biological weapons development and human experimentation. The location was carefully chosen. Manchuria was occupied territory where Japanese authority was absolute. The local Chinese population was viewed by the occupiers as inferior and expendable. International observers had limited access. Atrocities could be committed with minimal risk of exposure. The initial facility was relatively small, but in 1936, Ishii received approval for a massive expansion. The new complex was built near the village of Pingfang, outside Harbin, the largest city in Manchuria. The facility eventually covered 6 square kilometers, roughly 1,500 acres. It was designated the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantong Army. Officially Unit 731, the complex included over 150 buildings, laboratories, barracks, administration buildings, crematoria, power plants, and specialized facilities for specific research programs. There were animal breeding facilities housing rats, fleas, and other disease vectors by the millions. Production facilities capable of manufacturing hundreds of kilograms of biological agents, and at the center, the main laboratory complex, a 3-story building where the human experiments were conducted. The building had special features: reinforced doors, observation windows, drainage systems designed for easy cleaning of blood and bodily fluids. The Japanese called the human subjects maruta, meaning logs, dehumanizing language that made the atrocities psychologically easier. The subjects were prisoners, officially labeled as criminals or spies. In reality, they were Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, Korean independence activists, and others deemed expendable by the occupation authorities. Entire families were imprisoned together: men, women, children, even infants. Age and gender were variables to be studied. Once imprisoned in Unit 731, survival was impossible. Every subject was eventually killed, either by the experiments themselves or by execution afterward to prevent witnesses. The scale of operations required substantial personnel. At its height, Unit 731 employed over 3,000 people. These weren't all scientists. Most were support staff, animal handlers, maintenance workers, administrative personnel, guards, but approximately 300 were doctors, researchers, and technicians directly involved in the experimental work. These were educated men, university graduates. Many held advanced degrees from prestigious institutions. They were Japan's scientific elite, and they participated willingly, even enthusiastically, in atrocities that violated every principle of medical ethics. How does a doctor become a monster? How does a healer become a torturer? The answer involves ideology, dehumanization, careerism, and institutional structure that normalized the horrific imperial. Japan's military culture emphasized absolute obedience and viewed conquered peoples as racially inferior. Chinese, Koreans, and others were depicted in propaganda as less than human. This dehumanization was essential. It's difficult to vivisect a human being. It's easier to vivisect a log. Career incentives mattered too. Working at Unit 731 offered prestige, resources, and opportunities for advancement. Researchers published papers, though with fabricated explanations of how data was obtained. The institutional structure created diffusion of responsibility. No single person killed a subject. One person infected them. Another monitored symptoms. A third performed the autopsy. Each participant could tell themselves they were just doing their job, just following orders, just conducting research. The same psychological mechanisms that enabled the Holocaust-enabled Unit 731. Ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when the right conditions exist. Ideological justification, institutional authority, dehumanization of victims, diffusion of responsibility, and peer pressure. Dr. Ishii understood these mechanisms. He carefully structured Unit 731 to exploit them. He cultivated an atmosphere of scientific enthusiasm. Researchers competed to design experiments and publish results. Success was rewarded with promotions and recognition. the human cost was invisible to most personnel. The logs arrived, were experimented upon in sealed rooms, and disappeared into the crematoria. Most Unit 731 staff never directly witnessed the suffering. They just processed paperwork, maintained equipment, or analyzed data. This allowed them to maintain psychological distance from the reality of what they were enabling. The experiments themselves were carefully documented. Detailed logs recorded every variable: dosages, exposure times, environmental conditions, symptoms, progression, and death. Photographs documented external symptoms. Autopsies revealed internal effects. Tissue samples were preserved. The documentation was thorough because the work was genuinely intended as scientific research. Twisted and monstrous though it was, this documentation would later become extremely valuable. Chapter 2. The experiment. What happened inside Unit 731 almost defies comprehension. The experiments conducted there represent some of the most horrific acts committed during World War II, and that's saying something given the context. The details that follow are disturbing but historically necessary. These events happened. These people suffered. Their experience deserves acknowledgement, not euphemism. The core research program focused on biological warfare agents. Plague was studied extensively. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic and pneumonic plague, was cultivated in massive quantities. Researchers infected subjects with plague through various methods: injection, inhalation, contaminated food, and through flea bites. They documented the progression of disease, the effectiveness of different exposure methods, and the timeline from infection to death. Subjects received no treatment. The point was to study the natural course of the disease and determine optimal methods for weaponization. Anthrax was another major research focus. Bacillus anthracis spores were tested through inhalation, ingestion, and skin exposure. The researchers were particularly interested in aerosol dispersal. How small must particles be for effective inhalation infection? What concentration is necessary? How does humidity affect viability? These questions were answered through human experimentation. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and other diseases were similarly studied. Subjects were infected and their suffering meticulously documented. But biological agents were just one research area. Vivisection, surgical experimentation on living humans, was routine. The justification was that autopsies on disease victims needed to be conducted while organs were still alive to observe the full effects of infection. In practice, this meant subjects were strapped to operating tables and dissected while fully conscious. Without anesthesia, surgeons removed organs one by one, observing how the body responded, how long subjects survived, and documenting every detail. The screams were supposedly so disturbing that the scree-secture roofs were soundproofed. Vivisection was also used to train Army surgeons. Young doctors practiced surgical techniques on living prisoners, treating them as medical training dummies. Amputations, organ removal, and various procedures were performed for practice, not treatment. Frostbite experiments were conducted too. Developed treatments for Japanese soldiers fighting in cold climates. Subjects had limbs exposed to extreme cold, sometimes by being forced to stand outside in winter, sometimes by immersion in ice water, sometimes by having frozen water poured over limbs. Once frostbite set in, treatments were tested. Limbs were thawed using various methods: hot water at different temperatures, gradual warming, rapid warming. Exposure to heat lamps. The goal was determining which method produced the best functional recovery. The suffering involved was irrelevant to the researchers. Advanced frostbite cases were studied until the frozen limbs became gangrenous and subjects died from infection or organ failure. Pressure chamber experiments tested the limits of human tolerance to rapid decompression. Subjects were placed in sealed chambers, and the air pressure was rapidly reduced to simulate high altitude. Conditions. Researchers documented at what pressure. Subjects lost consciousness when organs began to fail. When death occurred, some subjects' eyes ruptured from the pressure change. Others hemorrhaged from every orifice. The experiments continued to lethal endpoints. Weapon effectiveness studies used living human targets, grenades, flamethrowers, and other weapons were tested on restrained subjects at various distances to document injury patterns and lethality. Biological weapon dispersal systems were tested using plague-infected fleas and bacteria-laden bombs dropped on live prisoners. To measure infection rates, poison gas weapons, prohibited by international law but developed by Japan anyway, were tested in gas chambers with human subjects. Different concentrations and exposure times were documented. Subjects who survived initial exposure were observed until death to understand long-term effects. Blood transfusion experiments tested compatibility between different races. Japanese military ideology included beliefs about Japanese racial superiority, and researchers conducted experiments to support these beliefs. Subjects were drained of blood and transfused with animal blood or incompatible human blood to observe the results. The experiments were scientifically worthless but ideologically motivated. Surgical experiments included vivisection to study organ function, experimental procedures with no therapeutic purpose, and practice surgeries on healthy subjects who were killed afterward. Women were subjected to specific experiments including forced pregnancy, syphilis infection studies, and rape by prisoners infected with various diseases to study sexual transmission. Children were not spared. Pediatric disease progression, dosage calculations, and age-related vulnerability were all studied. Using child subjects, infants were infected with various diseases to document progression in the very young. The youngest subject on record was only a few months old. The total number of people killed at Unit 731 is unknown with certainty. Conservative estimates based on crematorium capacity and documented prisoner transfers suggest at least 3,000 deaths. Some researchers believe the true number could be 10,000 or more when including deaths from all of Unit 731's satellite facilities throughout Manchuria. Unit 731 was the largest, but not the only such facility. Unit 100 conducted biological warfare research on animals and agricultural targets. Unit 516 developed chemical weapons. Several smaller units existed throughout occupied territories. The network of facilities employed over 10,000 people total across the Japanese biological and chemical weapons program, but Unit 731 in Pingfang remained the center of human experimentation. The psychological impact on victims who survived even temporarily was devastating beyond measure. Survivors from the prison sections who were awaiting experimentation described the constant terror. The screams from the laboratory building, the smoke from the crematoria, the knowledge that death was inevitable and would be preceded by unimaginable suffering. Some prisoners attempted suicide. The guards prevented this when possible, not from mercy, but because subjects needed to be healthy for experiments. The few individuals who survived to eventually testify after the war described experiences that haunted them for the rest of their lives. One survivor recalled being in a cell when he heard the prisoner in the next cell begging for mercy as he was taken for experimentation. The begging turned to screaming that lasted for hours before finally stopping. The prisoner never returned. The psychological impact on the perpetrators is harder to document, but equally important to understand. Some Unit 731 personnel later expressed remorse. Many did not. Most simply refused to discuss their activities. Post-war interviews with Unit 731 staff revealed various psychological mechanisms. Some claimed they didn't know what was really happening, despite working at the facility. This seems implausible, but may represent genuine psychological denial. Others argued they were following orders and had no choice. In reality, there's no evidence anyone was forced to participate. This was volunteer work. Some maintained that the work was necessary for Japanese national defense and that the subjects were criminals who deserved their fate. The most disturbing responses came from those who showed no remorse whatsoever. They described the experiments clinically as scientific work, without acknowledging the human suffering involved. This suggests complete moral disengagement, where victims were so thoroughly dehumanized that their suffering registered no emotional impact. Dr. Ishii himself never expressed remorse. In post-war interrogations, he defended the work as militarily necessary and scientifically valuable. He died in 1959 of throat cancer, never having been prosecuted for war crimes. But we're getting ahead of the story. Chapter 3. The Biological Warfare Campaign. Unit 731 wasn't just researching biological weapons. They were using them between 1940 and 1945. The Japanese military conducted multiple biological PHL warfare attacks against Chinese civilian and military targets. These operations represented the first systematic use of biological weapons in modern warfare. The attacks began in 1940. Plague-infected fleas were produced in massive quantities at Unit 731 and dispersed over Chinese cities. The method was crude but effective. Aircraft dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over populated areas. The bombs broke on impact, releasing the fleas. Within weeks, plague outbreaks occurred. The disease spread through the population, killing hundreds or thousands depending on the attack. The first confirmed biological warfare attack occurred in Ningbo in October 1940. Japanese aircraft dropped wheat and rice mixed with plague-infected fleas. Within days, plague cases appeared. The outbreak killed approximately 100 people before being controlled. But this was just the beginning. In 1941, Changti was attacked with plague-infected fleas. The resulting outbreak killed approximately 7,000 people over several months. The Japanese military tested different dispersal methods. Ceramic bombs filled with infected insects, contaminated food dropped by aircraft, infected materials left in abandoned supplies for Chinese forces to find. They also contaminated water supplies with cholera and typhoid bacteria. These attacks violated international law, specifically the 1925 Geneva Protocol, that Japan had signed but never ratified. But international law mattered little to Japanese military planners, who viewed biological weapons as legitimate tools of warfare. The attacks continued throughout the war. Dozens of documented incidents occurred, possibly many more that were never identified as biological warfare. Estimating the death toll is difficult. Plague and cholera outbreaks in wartime China had multiple causes. Not all can be attributed to Japanese biological warfare, but conservative estimates suggest at least 400,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers died from Japanese biological warfare attacks during World War II. Some estimates go much higher, suggesting the true death toll could exceed 1 million when including indirect deaths from disease, spread, and disrupted public health. These attacks represented the deadliest use of biological weapons in history, exceeding even the worst-case scenarios modern militaries plan. For that, the attacks also demonstrated significant problems with biological weapons from a military perspective. Disease doesn't respect battle lines. Multiple Japanese soldiers were infected and killed by the very weapons their own military deployed. In some cases, outbreaks among Japanese troops were worse than among Chinese forces. The weapons were difficult to control once released. Weather conditions affected dispersal patterns unpredictably. Disease progression varied by population. Containment was impossible from a strictly military perspective. Biological weapons proved less effective than conventional weapons while posing significant mesky risks to the attacking force. But they were cheap to produce compared to conventional weapons, and they generated terror among civilian populations. This terror effect seems to have been a primary goal, breaking Chinese morale and resistance through fear of invisible, uncontrollable death. The biological warfare campaign also served as large-scale testing for Unit 731's research. Researchers traveled to attack sites to collect data. They documented infection rates, death rates, dispersal patterns, and public health responses. Each attack provided data that informed the next, iteratively improving the weapons. This made Chinese civilians not just victims of warfare, but unwitting subjects in a vast experiment. The line between military operations and human experimentation blurred completely beyond plague and cholera. Unit 731 developed other biological weapons that were never deployed on a large scale. Anthrax bombs were developed and tested but not used operationally, possibly because researchers couldn't guarantee effective dispersal. Typhoid and paratyphoid contamination of water supplies occurred in several incidents. The unit also researched agricultural biological weapons intended to destroy crops and livestock. Unit 100 specifically focused on these agents. Plans existed for even more ambitious attacks. Documents recovered after the war revealed contingency plans for biological warfare attacks against the United States if the home islands were invaded. Operation Cherry Blossoms at night planned to use aircraft launched from submarines to spray plague-infected fleas over San Diego, California in September 1945. The operation was scheduled but never executed because Japan surrendered first. Had the attack occurred, it could potentially have caused hundreds of thousands of casualties and overwhelmed American public health infrastructure. This wasn't speculative. The submarines were ready. The plague-infected fleas were produced. The targeting was planned. Only the timing of Japan's surrender prevented the attack. American authorities learned of this plan after the war and were reportedly horrified by how close it had come to execution. But their horror didn't prevent them from finding the research valuable. Chapter 4. Surrender and Cover Up. August 9, 1945. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Dr. Ishii received orders to destroy Unit 731 immediately. The Soviets could not be allowed to capture the facility or its secrets. The destruction was thorough and systematic. First, all remaining prisoners were killed. Approximately 150 subjects were in the facility when the order came. They were executed and their bodies burned. Documents were sorted. The most valuable data was prepared for transport to Japan. Everything else was burned. Equipment was smashed. Building materials were doused with gasoline and burned. Explosives were set to demolish structures. The extensive animal breeding facilities housing millions of plague-infected fleas and rats posed a particular problem. The animals couldn't be left alive to spread disease uncontrollably. But killing and disposing of millions of diseased animals quickly was impossible. The decision was made to simply release them. Cages were opened. Animals fled into the surrounding countryside. Plague-infected rats and fleas spread into the local Chinese population. A massive plague epidemic resulted. estimates suggest 20,000 to 30,000. Chinese civilians died in the Harbin area in late 1945 and 1946 from plague directly, traceable to Unit 731's hasty evacuation. This final atrocity was committed not as experimentation or warfare, but simply as convenient disposal during retreat. Unit 731 personnel were evacuated south, first to Korea, then to Japan proper. Dr. Ishii reached Japan ahead of American occupation forces. He immediately began planning his defense. How do we prevent future atrocities? How do we ensure that scientific research respects human dignity and rights? The answer involves multiple elements: strong ethical frameworks, institutional oversight, international accountability mechanisms, protection for whistleblowers, and cultural commitment to justice, even when inconvenient. None of these protections existed effectively during World War II. Many remain weak today. The Unit 731 story also highlights the selective nature of post-war justice. Nazi war criminals were prosecuted extensively at Nuremberg and subsequent trials. The Holocaust is remembered as one of history's greatest crimes. Japanese war crimes, including Unit 731, received far less attention and accountability. This disparity reflects multiple factors: Cold War politics, racism, strategic calculations, and the accidents of how evidence was preserved and trials were conducted. But the result is that some atrocities are remembered while others are forgotten. And some perpetrators faced justice while others escaped. This uneven accountability undermines claims that international justice is impartial and universal. For the victims of Unit 731 and their descendants, justice remains incomplete. Many victims were never identified. Mass graves remain undiscovered. Full documentation of who was killed and how remains unavailable. Perpetrators lived full lives and died natural deaths. Most never acknowledged their crimes publicly. Some maintained their actions were justified. The psychological impact on survivors has been documented in interviews and testimony. Those who survived Unit 731 imprisonment before rescue, those who witnessed biological warfare attacks, those who lost family members, all carried trauma that affected them for life. Many suffered survivor's guilt. Some developed chronic mental health problems. Families were destroyed by loss and trauma. This suffering received no official acknowledgement. No compensation. No attempt at restorative justice from either Japan or the United States. The victims were sacrificed twice, once by the atrocities themselves, again by the political decisions to cover them up. Today, as direct survivors and perpetrators die of old age, the window for justice and full historical accounting is closing. Within a decade or two, no one with direct personal memory of Unit 731 will remain alive. The story will transition from living memory to pure history, subject to interpretation, denial, and political manipulation. This makes comprehensive documentation and education even more urgent. The Unit 731 Museum in Harbin, academic research, survivor testimony projects, and documentary films all contribute to ensuring these events are not forgotten. But challenges remain. Nationalistic governments in Japan and China both manipulate Unit 731's history for political purposes. Accurate education remains limited even in countries where the events occurred. In the West, Unit 731 receives minimal attention in standard history education. Most people have never heard of it. This allows the atrocities and the subsequent cover-up to remain hidden from public consciousness. The victims deserve better. History deserves better. Justice deserves better. The story of Unit 731 and the American Immunity Deal forces uncomfortable questions about justice. Knowledge and power. Can atrocity ever generate valuable knowledge? If it does, how should that knowledge be treated? Should war criminals be prosecuted regardless of strategic consequences? Or are some compromises justified? How do nations reckon with scientific atrocities committed in their name? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They have concrete implications for how we structure international justice, conduct scientific research, and hold power accountable. The consequentialist argument for the immunity deal goes like this. Unit 731's crimes had already occurred. Prosecuting the perpetrators wouldn't undo the suffering. But the data could potentially save lives if it prevented future biological attacks or informed defensive measures. In a Cold War context where Soviet biological weapons posed a genuine threat, American biological warfare research served defensive purposes. Using Unit 731 data strengthened American defenses and potentially saved more lives than justice for perpetrators was worth. This argument has several problems. First, it assumes the data was actually valuable and actually saved lives. This is unclear at best. Second, it ignores the precedent set. Protecting useful war criminals encourages future atrocities by suggesting they can be forgiven if they produce something valuable. Third, it treats justice as negotiable based on utilitarian calculation rather than as a fundamental principle. Fourth, it ignores the victim's perspective. Would Chinese families whose relatives were murdered accept that their suffering produced useful data that should be used? The deontological argument against the immunity deal is straightforward. Murder is wrong. Human experimentation without consent is wrong. War crimes are wrong. These truths don't depend on consequences or context. People who commit such crimes deserve punishment, regardless of whether punishing them is strategically convenient. In Japan, the trials generated more interest. Japanese media covered the proceedings. Though censorship by the American occupation authorities limited what could be published, many Japanese citizens learned for the first time that their military had conducted biological warfare and human experimentation. Public reaction was mixed. Some were horrified. Others refused to believe it. Many were simply exhausted by revelations of wartime atrocities and wanted to move forward. The broader issue of how Japan would reckon with its wartime actions remained unresolved and remains contentious to this day. Meanwhile, the United States continued extracting information from Unit 731 personnel. The interrogations that began in 1946 continued through the 1950s as American biological weapons. Researchers identified gaps in the data and requested additional information. Dr. Ishii and other Unit 731 veterans provided supplementary reports, clarifying details and expanding on initial disclosures. The relationship between American intelligence and former Unit 731 members became almost collegial. American researchers visited Japan to consult with their former enemies. Information was exchanged. Research directions were discussed. The scientific value of the Unit 731 data remains debated among historians and scientists. Some argue the data was scientifically worthless. The experiments were poorly designed. Variables weren't properly controlled. The suffering inflicted yielded little usable information. This perspective suggests that the United States made an immoral bargain for worthless data, compounding the injustice. Other analysts argue the data did have scientific value despite its horrific origin. Information about disease progression in humans, effective infection methods, dosage requirements, and weapon dispersal patterns was obtained that couldn't be replicated through ethical research. This perspective suggests the United States faced a genuine ethical dilemma: use tainted knowledge or abandon potentially valuable information. The truth is probably somewhere between these extremes. Some Unit 700 data was scientifically useful and informed American biological weapons research programs. Other data was methodologically flawed and contributed little, but regardless of scientific value, the moral calculation was clear, granting immunity to mass murderers in exchange for their research data violated fundamental principles of justice. It established a precedent that scientific knowledge could justify protecting war criminals. It sent a message that atrocities would be forgiven if they produced valuable information, and it denied justice to thousands of victims whose suffering was then appropriated for military advantage. The long-term consequences of this decision extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Chapter 6. Legacy and Implications. Unit 731. Immunity deal remained one of the Cold War's darker secrets for decades. American government documents remained classified. Participants maintained silence. The full story was known to only a few, but gradually, information leaked out in the 1980s. Investigative journalists in both the United States and Japan began uncovering the truth. American journalists filed Freedom of Information Act requests that forced declassification of interrogation reports and internal memoranda. Japanese journalists interviewed former Unit 731 personnel who were aging and sometimes willing to talk Chinese. Survivors and witnesses provided testimony about the attacks and experiments they had witnessed or endured. Academic historians began piecing together the full scope of Unit 731's activities and the subsequent immunity deal by the 1990s. The basic facts were established and publicly known. Public reaction, particularly in China and Korea, was intense outrage. The fact that the United States had protected war criminals responsible for atrocities against Chinese and Korean victims, and had done so for strategic advantage, generated lasting anger and mistrust. The Japanese government's response has been inadequate and inconsistent. Official acknowledgement of Unit 731's activities came slowly and reluctantly. For decades, the Japanese government denied or minimized the program's extent. Textbook controversies erupted repeatedly over how Unit 731 should be presented to Japanese students. If at all, right-wing Japanese nationalists have claimed that Unit 731 counts are exaggerated Chinese propaganda. Despite overwhelming evidence, progressive Japanese historians and activists have pushed for fuller acknowledgement and official apologies. As of 2025, the Japanese government acknowledges that Unit 731 existed and conducted biological warfare research. But official statements remain vague about the scope of human experimentation and atrocities. No formal apology has been issued to victims. No comprehensive reparations have been paid. Survivors and victims. Families have filed lawsuits in Japanese courts seeking acknowledgement and compensation. Most have been dismissed on technical grounds. The Unit 731 facility site near Harbin has been partially preserved as a museum and memorial. The museum documents the facility's activities with recovered artifacts, survivor testimony, and historical documentation. It serves as an important educational site and memorial to victims. Though its presentation reflects Chinese government perspectives and political objectives, in the United States, the immunity deal and its implications have received less public attention than they deserve. Most Americans remain unaware that their government protected war criminals who committed atrocities comparable to Nazi concentration camp doctors. When confronted with this history, common reactions include denial, rationalization, or relativism. Some argue that Cold War context justified the decision. Soviet biological weapons programs posed a threat. American security required whatever intelligence advantage was available. This argument prioritizes security over justice and accepts that war criminals can be useful and therefore should be Protected others argue that the United States was not responsible for prosecuting Japanese war crimes committed in China. That was China's responsibility, or a matter for international tribunals. This ignores that the United States actively prevented prosecution by hiding evidence and protecting perpetrators. The most honest assessment is that the United States faced an ethical choice and chose wrongly. Justice should have taken priority over intelligence gathering. War criminals should have faced trial, regardless of their knowledge. The fact that prosecuting them might have meant losing access to their data is unfortunate, but ethically irrelevant. Knowledge gained through atrocity should be treated as fruit of the poisonous tree, tainted and inadmissible. The precedent set by the Unit 731 immunity deal has troubling implications. It suggests that useful war criminals will be protected, that atrocities can be forgiven if they generate valuable information, that justice is negotiable when strategic interests are at stake. These are dangerous principles that undermine international law and human rights norms. The deal also raises questions about how the biomedical research community should handle data obtained through unethical means. Should Unit 731 data be used in modern research? Should it be cited in scientific papers? Should it inform public health decisions? Some argue that using the data honors victims by ensuring their suffering contributed to human knowledge and maybe saving lives. Others argue that using the data legitimizes it, suggesting that unethical research can be worthwhile if it produces useful results. Medical ethics consensus has generally moved toward not using data from unethical research. Though debate continues, the broader question is how societies reckon with scientific atrocities. Nazi medical experiments in concentration camps are widely condemned, and their perpetrators were prosecuted at Nuremberg. But many of those doctors received relatively light sentences. Some resumed medical careers after serving brief prison terms. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where American researchers deliberately left black men untreated to study disease progression, wasn't halted until 1972. Unethical human experimentation has occurred across multiple nations and continues in various forms today. Unit 731 represents an extreme case, but the underlying issues of scientific ethics, institutional accountability, and justice remain universally relevant. His primary strategy was simple: bargain. The data from Unit 731 represented years of research that no Western nation possessed. Human experimentation on this scale was impossible for American or Soviet researchers due to ethical constraints. The data was horrible, but scientifically valuable. Ishii bet that American authorities would trade immunity for information. He was absolutely right. When American reoccupation forces arrived in Japan in September 1945, biological warfare research was not initially a priority. The focus was on immediate humanitarian issues, disarmament, and political restructuring. Unit 731 had been destroyed. Its activities occurred in Manchuria, now occupied by the Soviets. There were rumors of Japanese biological warfare programs, but details were scarce. However, American military intelligence soon began receiving reports about Unit 731 from multiple sources. Chinese government representatives provided information about biological warfare attacks. Soviet interrogations of captured Japanese personnel revealed details. Japanese scientists began reaching out to American authorities, offering information. By early 1946, American occupation authorities understood that Japan had conducted extensive biological warfare research, including human experimentation. The question became, what to do about it? Several factors influenced American decision-making. First, the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. Any intelligence advantage over the Soviets was valuable. Denying them biological warfare data was a priority. Second, the Pentagon's own biological weapons program. The U.S. had conducted biological weapons research during the war at facilities like Fort Detrick. American researchers wanted the Japanese data. Third, the practical difficulties of prosecution. War crimes trials were complex and expensive. Evidence was destroyed. Witnesses were scattered. Jurisdiction was unclear since the crimes occurred in Manchuria. Fourth, and perhaps most important, was the precedent being set at the Nuremberg trials. The trials of Nazi war criminals were ongoing. The prosecution was establishing principles of individual responsibility for war. Crimes and crimes against humanity. Medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners were being prosecuted. Nazi doctors were being held accountable if the same standards were applied to Unit 731. Dozens of Japanese scientists and officers would face war crimes charges, possibly execution, but applying those standards consistently would mean surrendering valuable intelligence to moral principles. American authorities faced a choice: justice or intelligence advantage. They chose intelligence. The decision was made at high levels of the American Occupation Authority and likely approved in Washington. Dr. Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders would be granted immunity from war crimes prosecution in exchange for full disclosure of their research data. The deal was secret. No formal written agreement was created to avoid documentation, but the understanding was clear. Provide complete information about biological warfare research, and you will not be prosecuted. American interrogators conducted extensive interviews with Unit 731 personnel. Through 1946 and 1947, Dr. Ishii was interviewed multiple times. He provided detailed information about research programs, experimental results, and biological weapons production capabilities. He withheld nothing. The data was turned over completely, including photographs, autopsy reports, and detailed experimental logs. Other Unit 731 researchers were similarly interviewed. Different interrogators handled different subjects to cross-reference information. The Americans were thorough. They wanted every piece of information the Japanese had acquired in return. Unit 731 personnel were protected when Soviet authorities requested extradition of Japanese war criminals for trial. The Americans claimed they had no evidence of biological warfare crimes. This was a direct lie. American interrogators had extensive evidence provided by the Japanese themselves. When the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo equivalent of Nuremberg, was established to try Japanese war crimes, Unit 731 was not included. The tribunal prosecuted Japanese leaders for crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But biological warfare and human experimentation were excluded from the charges. The chief prosecutor, Joseph Keenan, later admitted this was a deliberate decision based on national security considerations. Translation: we wanted the data more than we wanted. Justice Dr. Ishii lived freely in Japan until his death in 1959. He was never prosecuted. He never spent a day in prison. He never faced public accountability for his crimes. Most other Unit 731 personnel similarly escaped justice. A few faced Soviet prosecution when captured by Soviet forces, but the vast majority lived normal post-war lives in Japan. Many resumed medical careers. Some became prominent doctors, professors, and researchers at Japanese universities and hospitals. The president of the Japan Medical Association from 1970 to 1982 was a former Unit 731 member. The chairman of Japan's National Institute of Health was a former Unit 731 researcher. These men built successful careers on knowledge gained through atrocities. The full extent of the American immunity deal remained secret for decades. Some information emerged in the 1980s, when American government documents were declassified under Freedom of Information Act requests. Journalists and historians pieced together what had happened. The scale of the cover-up became clear. The United States had knowingly protected war criminals, responsible for some of the worst atrocities of World War II. Not because justice was impossible, not because evidence was lacking, but because the data was valuable. This wasn't a failure of justice. It was a calculated sacrifice of justice for perceived strategic advantage. Chapter 5. The Soviet Trials while the United States granted immunity to Unit 731 personnel. The Soviet Union took a different approach. In December 1949, the USSR conducted the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in the far eastern Soviet city of Khabarovsk, near the Manchurian border. 12 Japanese personnel captured by Soviet forces were tried for biological warfare crimes. The defendants included military officers and Unit 731 members, who had been captured during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and held in Soviet custody. For 4 years, the trials lasted 1 week. The defendants were presented with extensive evidence, testimony from witnesses, documents recovered from Unit 731 sites, and physical evidence. All 12 defendants confessed to participating in biological warfare, research, and attacks. The confessions were detailed, describing experiments on human subjects, production of biological weapons, and attacks on Chinese civilians. The Soviets presented the trials as exposing Japanese atrocities that the American occupation was covering up. This was Soviet propaganda. But it was also true. The defendants were convicted. Sentences ranged from 2 to 25 years in labor camps. None were executed, possibly because the Soviets wanted to appear more merciful than the Americans were being at Nuremberg. The trials were documented and publicized by Soviet media. Transcripts were published and distributed internationally. The United States dismissed the trials as communist propaganda. American officials claimed the confessions were coerced. The evidence was fabricated, and the entire proceeding was a political show trial designed to embarrass the United States. Some of these claims had merit. Soviet war crimes trials did use coerced confessions and manipulated evidence, but in this case, the evidence was genuine and the confessions were substantially true. As later evidence would confirm, the United States was lying to protect its immunity. Deal with Unit 731 leaders, the Khabarovsk TRIALS revealed significant information about Unit 731 to the international community. For the first time, details about human experimentation and biological warfare attacks were presented publicly with supporting evidence, but the revelations had limited impact. Western media largely ignored the trials or dismissed them as Soviet propaganda. The Cold War was intensifying. Anything the Soviets said was viewed with suspicion. The fact that the Soviets were telling the truth in this case didn't matter. The political context determined how the information was received.